pretty good pain
I'm suing.
for emotional distress.
Okay, ready? Ready? That's ready. You're gonna be fine. Okay. Whatever. And
All right, if I can have everybody's attention. We're going to start out with a review question, and this is a good critical thinking question, I think. It's one I doubt if you've seen before, and there is a little twist to this too. I'll just forewarn you. You got to really think about this one, all right? Look at all the choices and try to figure out which one makes the most sense, okay? This is something that could actually be on our first exam on Monday, okay? As a reminder, our first exam is coming up on Monday. Friday, we will have a review, okay? So I know a lot of you are going to be gone. I'll put copies of the review questions on Canvas, okay? All right, so take a look at it and see if you can figure this one out. Okay, this one has to do with the autonomic nervous system and the control of the heart. So this is kind of a good segue into our next chapter. Like I said, this one does have a little twist to it, which makes it a little bit harder. Okay, let's go ahead. Go ahead and answer this if you haven't already. Okay. So, most popular answer was number 3. It would result in an immediate increase in heart rate. That's not a bad answer. In fact, that's pretty accurate because the vagus nerve ordinarily releases acetylcholine on the heart that binds to a muscarinic receptor, and that causes the heart rate to slow down. Right? That's when the vagus nerve is intact. So if you cut it, then that nerve is no longer going to be able to slow down the heart, right? And so that should cause the heart rate to increase, okay? That's not an unreasonable answer. However, the act of cutting a nerve can actually stimulate it, okay? Because if you take a pair of scissors and cut a nerve, you're cutting a hole in the membrane of the axon. And that's going to allow sodium to flood into the axon, and that will trigger an action potential. Okay? Especially if you have a dull pair of scissors. If you have a dull pair of scissors that sort of pinches the nerve at first, that can force open sodium channels, and that can trigger an action potential. And so when that happens, then you're going to get a burst of action potentials, which will release more acetylcholine on the heart. So that's going to temporarily decrease the heart rate. But since the nerve is cut, then it's no longer going to be able to stimulate the heart. And so then after a temporary decrease in heart rate, then you're going to get a permanent increase. So number 3 is not totally incorrect. But number 2, I think, is actually a better answer, because the act of cutting the nerve can stimulate it, which which is going to slow down the heart. But then once it's cut, it's damaged, it can no longer stimulate the heart, and then the heart rate will permanently increase. Okay, that's the twist to it. The twist to it is that the act of cutting could stimulate the nerve. Now that may not always happen, so sometimes it may just start going up. So in the case number 3 would be correct. So it kind of depends on how you cut it and how fast you cut it as to what effect it's going to be. All right. So today we are going to go ahead and start with chapter 19. This part's not going to be on our test. Yes?
Was it chapter 17 or 18 that wasn't going to be on the test?
Which one wasn't on the test?
Yeah. Did you say it was chapter 18?
Chapter 18, 15, and I think it's chapter 17. Well, all 3 of those will be on the test, yeah.
You said one wasn't going to be.
Yeah, that's the one.
This one isn't going to be on the test. This one. Okay, but this one wasn't scheduled. We're starting on this a little bit early because the fact that we're looking at the structure of the heart in lab, and so I want to familiarize you with all, even for those of you who have already had lab this week, this will help you for when you take the quiz, okay? And I think also this may even help you on the first exam too, because the heart does work with the blood vessels. And so, anyway, it all kind of fits together. And I think this will kind of help to cement everything together in your mind. So chapter 18 will not be on the test, but the 3 that are on the syllabus will be.
So chapter 18 is not on the test?
It won't be on the first exam,
Okay,
but it will be on the second exam. This won't be until the second exam. Okay, that's what I said on Wednesday. Okay. So, the circulatory system is also known as the cardiovascular system. In the strictest sense, the cardiovascular system, though, just refers to the heart and the blood vessels.
This one isn't on this slideshow.
Okay, let me, okay. How about if I just put it on after class? All right? Okay, so just,
We take notes on We take notes
oh,
on
okay, all right, fine. Okay.
Piece of shit. I'm literally I might as well take this grading for the best part
Okay, it should be showing up here momentarily. Okay, so the cardiovascular system consists of the heart and the blood vessels. Some people also consider the lymphatic system to be part of the cardiovascular system because the lymphatic vessels actually grow out of the blood vessels early on in development. So developmentally, it's all one system, but the lymphatic system includes more than just the lymphatic vessels, and so because of that, it's usually considered to be a separate organ system. We'll be considering a separate organ system, just like the author of our textbook does. So this is really important to understanding how the cardiovascular system functions, because there's actually 2 major circulatory routes that the blood passes through. The first one is called the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary circuit pumps blood through the lungs so that the oxygen poor blood that's returned from the organs can pick up oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide, and then it returns back to the left side of the heart. So the pulmonary circulation is pumped by the right side of the heart. And so it goes out of the pulmonary trunk, which then branches to form the pulmonary arteries. That carries the blood to the lungs where it picks up oxygen. And then the blood returns via the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins are the only veins that contain oxygen-rich blood. So in most of the circulatory system, arteries are carrying oxygen-rich blood. Veins are carrying oxygen-poor blood. But in the pulmonary circulation, it's just the opposite. Okay. Blood from the pulmonary veins flows into the left atrium of the heart, and then from there it goes down the left ventricle, and then it's pumped out through what's called the systemic circulation. The systemic circulation supplies all of the organs of the body, all the organs and tissues and cells, except for the lungs. So the lungs has its own separate circulatory route. Okay. So if you were to follow a single drop of blood, it would first flow through the pulmonary circulation from the right side of the heart to the lungs, and then back to the left side. And then the left side of the heart pumps the blood through the systemic circulation. And so the heart is really a double pump. It's like two pumps in one. But they're synchronized. They work together. So at the same time blood is being pumped by the right ventricle through the pulmonary circulation, blood is also being pumped by the left ventricle through the systemic circulation. Okay? So they're separate pumps, but they're very closely synchronized because the whole heart functions as a single unit. Okay? And so ordinarily there's no mixing of blood directly from the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart because there's a septum. There's a wall that separates the inside of the heart in half. There's a septum between the two atria, which are the upper chambers, and there's even a thicker septum between the two ventricles, which are the two lower chambers of the heart. Now, in addition, the heart doesn't benefit from the blood that passes through its chambers. Because there's an endocardium, there's a thin membrane that separates the blood from the cardiac muscle. So the walls of the heart itself have another circulatory system called the coronary circulation. And the coronary circulation actually starts out off of the base of the aorta, which is part of the systemic circulation. So it's really sort of a subdivision. The way I look at it anyway, it's sort of a subdivision of the systemic circulation. But if you look on the inside of the base of the aorta, you'll see two little holes, one on the right side, one on the left side. Blood goes through those holes and into the right and left coronary arteries, which branch into smaller and smaller branches, and that supplies the walls of the heart with blood. And then there's also a venous system. And so we looked at that in lab yesterday. We'll be looking at that in the Thursday lab tomorrow. And we'll go over it again in here eventually. I don't know if we'll get to that today, but we'll either do that today or after the exam next week. All right, so the heart itself is located, part of it's located slightly to the left of the midline. About 2/3 of it is located to the left of the midline in a part of our chest called the mediastinum. The mediastinum is not a cavity. It's more of a region. Mediastinum is actually the region between the two lungs. So the mediastinum is this whole area from between the two lungs, between the apex of the right and left lung, and between the bases of the two lungs. So this whole area is the mediastinum. in that area you have the heart, as well as the two large arteries that carry blood out of the heart, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay, so externally, the pointed end of the heart that points downward and slightly to the left is called the apex of the heart. And at the opposite end of the heart, up here at the top, is the base. The base is where the aorta and the pulmonary trunk is attached to the heart. Okay, so those are two major parts of the surface anatomy. And then the heart is actually enclosed by two thin serous membranes. The deepest one, the deepest membrane, you can see it right here. This red tissue, that's called the myocardium. That's where the cardiac muscle is located. So sitting right on top of the myocardium is a very thin, transparent membrane called the visceral pericardium, or the epicardium. If you're just focusing on the membranes, you'd probably want to call it the visceral pericardium. And then the visceral pericardium actually is reflected, and then it bends around and it forms another layer surrounding the visceral pericardium. So there's another outer layer. This outer layer is called the parietal pericardium. Okay, and on the outside of the parietal pericardium, there's some fibrous connective tissue that's fused to the parietal pericardium, and that forms what's called the pericardial sac. Okay, so there's two serous membranes, visceral pericardium on the inside and the parietal pericardium on the outside. The parietal pericardium also has some fibrous connective tissue surrounding it, and that forms the pericardial sac. So when you open up the chest of a cadaver, it looks like the heart is sitting in a sac. That sac is the pericardial sac. You can't really, and that's made up mostly of the parietal pericardium. You can't really see the visceral pericardium because it's transparent, and it's attached very closely to the surface of the heart. Now, also, some of this pericardial sac attaches the apex of the heart to the diaphragm. So when you inhale and your diaphragm drops down, it flattens out and drops down, that pulls down the apex of the heart because it's actually, they're actually connected. All right, so then the walls of the heart itself are made up of 3 layers. We went through this in lab yesterday, and we'll go through this again tomorrow. As I said, the outer layer is the epicardium, or the visceral pericardium. The middle layer is the myocardium. That consists of cardiac muscles as well as blood vessels that are part of the coronary circulation. And then on the inside of the heart, you have another thin layer called the endocardium. And the endocardium lines the inside of the chambers of the heart as well as covering the valves. And the endocardium really is just a continuation of the endothelium, which is the innermost layer of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And so that endocardium is continuous with the endothelium of the blood vessels. That endothelium has a substance that prevents the platelets from sticking to it. And so the endocardium on the inside of the heart also has that same substance, and that prevents the platelets from sticking to the inside of the heart and forming blood clots in the heart. Okay, then in addition, internally the heart, and this is located right at the base of the heart, on the top of the heart, there's a fibrous skeleton that's made up of fibrous connective tissue. And this fibrous skeleton provides a framework that supports the valves of the heart, supports the atrioventricular valves and also the semilunar valves. So that provides support for the cardiac muscle and also the valve tissue. And it also provides some electrical insulation between your atria and your ventricles, because the atria and the ventricles are stimulated to contract electrically at different times, and so you don't want those signals to travel very quickly from the atria down to the ventricles, because that would throw the heart out of sync. Normally the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles. You wouldn't want them both to contract at the same time. Blood wouldn't be able to flow properly through the heart if that happened. All right. Now, a major part of the heart and what allows it to function the way it does are its chambers. And there are 4 chambers in the heart. There are 2 upper chambers called the atria. There's one on the right called the right atrium, one on the left called the left atrium. And then there are 2 larger chambers in the inferior part of the heart. Those are called the ventricles. And the one on the right is the right ventricle, one on the left is the left ventricle. Now, most of the mass, contrary to what diagrams look like in textbooks, most of the mass of the heart is in the form of the ventricles. Probably 85–90% of the mass of the heart is in the form of ventricles. The atria have very thin walls, and they're actually a lot smaller than what it looks like on this diagram, especially when there's no blood filling the atria. But so the outside of the atria are called the auricles. Auricle is the outer part of the atrium. So externally, there's a right auricle on the outside and a left auricle on the left side. And the inside of those auricles is where the atria are. Okay. So the atria mainly are receiving chambers for blood that's returned from the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation, but they also have the ability to contract. In fact, they contract first and they pump blood down into the ventricles. And then following contraction of the atria, then the ventricles contract and that pumps the blood out of the heart. So the ventricles do most of the work. The ventricles do probably 90% of the work of the heart, because they have that's the part of the heart that pumps the blood out to the body. All right, so let's do another review question. Okay, this says if a tear occurred in the interventricular septum, that's the septum between the 2 ventricles, blood would flow which direction? So blood would flow between what 2 parts of the heart if there was a hole in the interventricular septum? So you should be able to eliminate 2 of these choices right off the bat, and then it's a question of which of the others 2 it is. Let's take a look at the answers. Okay, most of you said from the left ventricle to the right ventricle. Okay, so the interventricular septum There's a wall between the two ventricles. So but the choices 1 and 2 would make sense. Okay, that's not where that septum's located. Okay, sometimes people have a hole between in the intraatrial septum too, especially right after birth, because before birth there's actually a hole between those two. Before birth, blood bypasses the pulmonary circulation, because when the fetus is in the uterus, it's not breathing. So it's not getting oxygen from the lungs, it's getting oxygen from the placenta. So it has to be either 3 or 4. So more of you picked number 3. Why was that? Why would blood flow from the left to the right? Because ordinarily blood returns to the right side of the heart. It goes to the lungs to the left, so it goes from right to left. But why would it go from left to right? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just wondering, why did you pick that choice? I didn't hear everything you said, but I thought I heard you use the word pressure. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay, has to do with pressures, right. So the left side of the heart has to pump blood throughout the whole body. And if you look at the walls of the left ventricle, the walls of the left ventricle are a lot thicker, because the more muscle you have in the walls, the harder you can push the blood out of the heart, okay? And so the pressure in the left ventricle is higher than it is in the right ventricle. The walls of the right ventricle are a lot thinner. And so most of the blood would be flowing from the left ventricle to the right ventricle, okay? And so that would compromise the amount of blood that's being pumped out of the heart. Okay, so your what's called the stroke volume of the heart, the amount of blood that's pumped out of the heart with each cycle would be decreased. Okay, and that would probably starve some of your organs of blood. All right, good. So that is correct. So number 3 is correct. All right. Okay. Now, in addition, there are valves between each atrium and its corresponding ventricle, and between each of the ventricles and the large vessel that carries the blood out of the heart. And so the 2 valves that are between each atrium and the ventricle that's right below it are called the atrioventricular valves. It makes sense because they're between the atrium and the ventricle. The one on the right side is called the right atrioventricular valve, or the right AV valve for short, and the one on the left is called the left AV valve. Now they also have alternative names though. So the one on the right, in addition to being called the right atrioventricular valve, it's also known as the tricuspid valve, because there are 3 cusps or flap of tissue that comes together when that valve closes. And the valve on the left is also called the bicuspid valve. Bi means 2, so the bicuspid valve has 2 cusps that come together when that valve closes. And then another name for the bicuspid valve, which you don't hear as much anymore, but it's still a valid name, it's still being used, is the mitral valve. The name mitral valve comes from the word mitre, which mitre is the name for the caps like Catholic bishops and the like Catholic bishops wear. Okay, but it's more commonly just called the bicuspid valve. All right. Now, the purpose of those bicuspid valves is that when the atria contract, that pumps blood down to the ventricles. And then once that happens, the ventricles contract. When the ventricles contract, the pressure inside the ventricle starts increasing, and that forces the AV valves closed so that blood doesn't go backwards back into the atria. Because Because when the ventricles contract, you want that blood to be pumped out of the heart to the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And so the valves ensure that the blood flows in the proper direction through the heart and that it doesn't backwash, it doesn't go back the wrong way. If that happened, then again, you wouldn't pump as much blood out of the heart. And then, in addition, there are two semilunar valves, and you can only see one in this diagram. This one right here at the base of the pulmonary trunk, so it's between the pulmonary trunk and the right ventricle. That's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then there's another one which you can't see. It looks just like this one. There's another semilunar valve right up here, right at the base of the aorta, between the left ventricle and the ascending aorta. That one's called the aortic semilunar valve. And unfortunately, you can't see that in this diagram. So the semilunar valves, that prevents the blood from going back into the heart from those two large arteries when the ventricles start to relax. So when the ventricles start to relax, the pressure in the ventricle starts dropping, and that forces those valves closed, so that way the blood can't just go back into the ventricles. So again, it just ensures that the blood travels the right direction through the heart. Okay, so one of the things I want you to be able to do eventually is to describe the flow of blood through the ventricles of the heart, as well as the valves that the blood goes through. Okay, so this is a little animation of the flow of blood through the heart. So I don't know if the sound is still bad in here through the speakers. There's still an echo. I don't know, sometimes it's worse than others. Let's go ahead and see how it sounds here. If there's too much echo that it makes it hard to understand, I'll just narrate it myself. So let's give it a try here and see.
The heart is a muscular pump with 4 chambers,
It's not bad.
2 thin-walled atria, and 2 thick-walled ventricles. The atria collect blood returning to the heart, whereas the ventricles pump blood from the heart. Oxygen-poor blood enters the right atrium through the superior and inferior vena cavae. The superior vena cava collects venous blood from the head, neck, upper limbs, and thorax. The inferior vena cava collects venous blood from the abdomen, pelvis, and lower limbs. Venous blood from the heart itself enters the right atrium from the coronary sinus. Contraction of the right atrium forces blood through the right atrioventricular valve, also known as the tricuspid valve, and into the right ventricle. Right ventricular contraction then propels the oxygen-poor blood through the pulmonary or semilunar valve and into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk divides into a right and left pulmonary artery, which carry oxygen-poor blood to their respective lung for gas exchange. These are the only arteries that carry oxygen-poor blood. Oxygen-rich blood returns from the lungs through the 4 pulmonary veins to the left atrium. These are the only veins that carry oxygen-rich blood. Contraction of the left atrium forces blood through the left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid or mitral valve, and into the left ventricle. Left ventricular contraction propels the oxygen-rich blood through the aortic or semilunar valve and into the aorta for distribution to the body.
Okay, so, as I said, one of the things I'd like you to be able to do is describe the flow of blood through the heart, starting with the return of blood to the right atrium. So, let me give you an example of what I want you to do. We can just do like just a flow diagram. I'll draw this up here on the board. So, let's start out right here with the right atrium. Okay, so blood returns to the right atrium from the superior from the lower part of the body. From the right atrium, the blood then flows down into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Or the right AV valve. And then from the right ventricle, blood is pumped out through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk then branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries. To the right lung and the left lung. And then from the right and left lung, blood returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Right and left pulmonary veins. And that carries blood back to the left atrium. And then from the left atrium, blood is going to flow into the left ventricle through the bicuspid valve. Or the left AV valve. And then from the left ventricle, blood is pumped into the aorta through the aortic valve, or aortic semilunar valve. And then the aorta has branches that carry the blood throughout the body. And then from there, blood is returned to, back to the heart, back to the right atrium of the heart, through either the superior vena cava or through the inferior vena cava. Okay, so that in a nutshell then describes the flow of blood through the heart, as well as the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation. The only thing we've left out here is the coronary circulation, but I think I'll leave that for another day. Okay. So any questions? Now, there's lots of questions I could ask on a test from this. Okay. I'm probably not going to ask you to draw the whole thing out on a test. But what I could ask you to do is I could say, when the blood passes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, what valve does it go through? Or what valve does the blood go through when blood is pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta? Okay, that would go to the aortic. So you have to know this to be able to answer those questions. Okay. All right. Any questions then? Okay. Well, hopefully that will help when we have our quiz on the heart in lab next week. But first we have an exam on Monday for the first 3 chapters we went over this semester. So Friday we'll have a review session. I know a lot of you are going to be gone, I think. How many of you are going to be gone on Friday? Raise your hand. Okay. Not too bad. Not too many. So I have some review questions I could publish on Canvas. They're in the form of a Jeopardy game like we did last semester. So we might go through some of those questions in class on Friday. Okay. Or I may take some of those and put them in a different format, but I can still post the questions on there. So, all right, well, I think I'm going to stop here because I don't want to go too far. I don't want to get too far ahead before our first exam. So.